Snow fell like shards of glass across the lonely bridge in Snowbridge, Montana. A soldier named Silas Carter stood in silence, ready to surrender to the cold, when a child's voice pierced the storm. "Sir, could you bury my sister?" From the blizzard staggered a 6-year-old girl in a torn pink dress, clutching a bundle so small it seemed weightless. At her side, a German shepherd pressed close, its eyes locked on Silas as if pleading. He pulled back the cloth inside. A baby's breath flickered like a dying candle. In that moment, Silas faced the same choice that had once broken him. Let another life fade, or fight the storm, the past, and his own despair to save her. The storm had swallowed Snowbridge whole. Snow fell in sheets, not gentle but harsh, as though the sky itself wanted to bury the earth beneath its weight. The wooden bridge creaked under the battering wind, its rails half buried in frost, and the stream below lay frozen in broken shards, water groaning beneath thin veils of ice. Beyond the bridge, the white fields stretched toward St. Mary's Bluff, the cemetery where stone crosses protruded from snowdrifts like the bones of giants. Silas Carter stood there, his boots sinking into the icy crust, his broad shoulders hunched but unprotected by any coat. He carried the cold as if he welcomed it, letting the snow sting his weathered face. Silas was 38, a man carved by years of battle. His hair, once dark, was streaked with the gray of sleepless nights. A scar cut across his cheek, faint but permanent, the kind only earned in places where chaos was louder than prayer. His chest rose heavily under a worn wool uniform jacket. He still wore military green even though the war had ended years ago, as though he could not shed the skin of a soldier. But inside that armor, his heart had long since retreated into silence. His wife, Margaret, had died from fever and winter's grip, and his little daughter Emma had followed with a heart too fragile to endure. Their graves stood side by side beneath the white veil of St. Mary's Bluff, and Silas's eyes, hollow and dim, lingered on the carved names. He whispered into the wind, his voice breaking like ice underfoot. "I'm tired. Perhaps it's time I follow." His breath rose like smoke, carried away by the gale. For a moment he believed the snow itself might claim him, bury him where he stood, and he almost welcomed the idea. Then through the storm came another sound. It was not the cry of wind or the groan of wood. It was the stuttering crunch of small boots on the snow-clogged path. Silas turned, his brow furrowing, and through the haze he saw a figure stumble onto the bridge. At first it seemed the storm had conjured a ghost, a little girl, no more than 6, hair tangled and plastered to her cheeks, wearing a dress that must once have been pink but now hung in rags, soaked and crusted with ice. In her thin arms she clutched a bundle wrapped in a torn gray cloth. Her lips were blue, her face pale, but her eyes, large and desperate, held onto a flicker of life. She collapsed forward, knees striking the icy planks. When she lifted her head, her voice rasped out, trembling and raw. "Sir, could you bury my sister?" The words cut through Silas like a blade. For a moment he could not breathe. Slowly he knelt, his calloused hands reaching for the bundle. The cloth was heavy with wet snow, but when he peeled it back, the world shifted. Inside was a baby girl, no older than a few months. Her hair, fine and damp, clung to her forehead. Her lips were faintly purple, and her breath came shallow, ragged. Yet there against all despair was warmth, a flicker of breath. Life still clung. Silas's heart jolted like a drum struck after years of silence. "No," he muttered, voice hoarse but fierce. "Not yet." He drew the infant against his chest, pressing her tiny body beneath his coat, wrapping his arms around her as if the heat of his soul could shield her from death. Beside him, a shadow moved. Out of the storm padded Valor, the German shepherd that had followed Silas since his discharge from the army. Valor was broad-shouldered, his coat black and tan, his eyes sharp amber that could see both kindness and threat. Loyal beyond doubt, he was Silas's last living companion. He lowered his head now, nudging the girl's frozen hand with his warm muzzle, as if to say, "You're not alone." The child flinched, then gave the faintest sob, her tears freezing on her lashes. Silas studied her, the fragility of her limbs, the trembling that shook her frame. "What's your name?" he asked. She swallowed, voice breaking. "Anna. And your sister?" The girl glanced at the infant bundled inside his coat. Grace! The names lodged in Silas's throat, heavy as stones. Grace, Emma's middle name. He looked back at the graves, snow biting his skin, and felt the cruel circle of fate pressing upon him. For a moment, silence stretched. Then the storm itself seemed to crack as Valor lifted his nose to catch a snowflake, sneezed so loudly it startled both of them, and shook his head furiously. Anna let out a short, startled laugh, small but bright against the blizzard. Silas almost smiled, though it came out more like a sigh. Even in despair, life found ways to remind them it still wanted to be lived. But the past would not release him so easily. As Silas held Grace close, his mind flickered back to another storm, another battlefield. The tent had smelled of blood and smoke. A young soldier convulsed after an injection, and a scream tore the air. You gave him the wrong shot. Every eye had turned on Silas, and though he had tried to explain, though he had known something was amiss with the supplies, he bowed his head and took the blame. The shame had followed him like a brand, driving him away from medicine, away from trust, away from himself. Now with Grace's fragile chest rising beneath his hand, the memory lashed him. Another child, another chance. He would not fail this one. He lifted his gaze to Anna. Snow clung to her lashes, her lips trembling as if she would collapse. He reached out, steadying her with one arm. Valor pressed against her side, his warmth seeping into her ragged dress. Together they formed a small island of heat in the sea of winter. Silas drew in a deep breath, his voice a vow cut from stone. Listen to me, Anna. When I'm here, no one gets buried while there's still breath in them. Anna blinked, confusion and hope mingling in her eyes. Grace gave the faintest twitch, a hand so tiny it barely reached beyond the cloth, but it curled against Silas's shirt as if to cling to life itself. He felt his chest clench. Emma's small hand had once clutched him like that before it grew still forever. He would not let that memory repeat. He rose to his feet, cradling Grace securely, and held out his hand to Anna. Come, we need warmth, shelter. My farm isn't far. Anna hesitated, her small hand quivering before sliding into his palm. Valor barked once, sharp but certain, as if confirming the path. Silas glanced one last time at the graves under snow, then turned away. Together man, child, infant, and dog. They crossed the bridge of Snowbridge, snow swirling around them, the storm howling, but unable to stop the fragile line of life they carried toward Whispering Pines. The farm sat at the edge of the forest like a weary sentinel, its roof draped in heavy snow, its walls groaning with every lash of the storm. Whispering Pines had once been a proud homestead, but years of neglect had weathered it down to a shadow. The barn leaned like an old man who had seen too much. The fences sagged under the weight of white drifts, and the windows of the farmhouse rattled with every gust of wind. Yet inside, for the first time in years, the hearth glowed. The fireplace crackled, flames licking at logs Silas had thrown on with urgency. The air smelled of smoke, damp wool, and faintly of the leather straps still clinging to his boots. Silas lowered Grace onto a wooden bench near the fire, his coat wrapped tight around her. He pressed 2 fingers gently to her chest, then leaned close, listening for the faint flutter that seemed to vanish and return like a ghost. He bent, breathed into her mouth with short, careful puffs, and pressed rhythmically against her chest. His hands steady, though his heart thundered. Years had passed since he had dared to act as a medic, but his training rose again, like muscle memory buried under rubble. Sweat mingled with melted snow on his brow as he worked, whispering under his breath as if commanding the child to fight. Anna sat near the fire, her thin knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped around herself. The flicker of the flames made her seem even smaller, a child half hidden in shadow. Her hair, tangled and dark, stuck to her cheeks in wet strands, and her torn dress revealed bruises on her legs where the cold had bitten deep. Valor lay stretched across the doorway, his broad frame blocking the draft. His ears flicked with each creak of the house, his amber eyes fixed on Anna, as if promising silently, "You are safe as long as I stand here." "Keep close to the fire," Silas told her, his voice roughened by years of disuse but not unkind. She nodded, her small chin quivering. Then the words poured from her like a flood held back too long. My father, Edward, they came for the land. Her voice cracked, catching on each memory. He stood up to them, and they beat him. My mother, Sarah, she tried to stop them, but they dragged her away. I don't know if she's alive. I took Grace and ran. Silas paused, his jaw tightening. Edward Miller. He remembered the man faintly, a quiet farmer in town, a good hand with horses, honest to a fault. But the name that seared him like fire was the one Anna whispered next. The man who took her, he wore a medal, silver, and his eyes were like ice. He said his name was Cole Blackthorne. The air seemed to vanish from the room. Silas's hand froze above Grace's chest, his breath heavy. Blackthorne. The syllables cracked open scars thought long sealed. Cole Blackthorne, the officer with the silver medal who had stood in the shadows of a field hospital years ago when the medicine had been switched. The one whose cold voice had condemned Silas with silence, more than words ever could. He had vanished after the war, leaving Silas to carry the weight of disgrace, and now his name returned on the lips of a child. Silas bent his head, pressing his hand hard against his knee until his knuckles whitened. Rage stirred, but beneath it, an oath forged itself like iron cooling in snow. He would not let Blackthorne steal more lives. He looked at Anna, at the fragile breath of Grace, at Valor standing guard, and he said quietly but firmly, "No one will tear you apart again." Not while I breathe, Valor stirred then, ears pricking, nose lifted. He padded to the corner of the room where an old quilt lay in a heap. He sniffed, then tugged, revealing a strip of cloth stained with dried blood. Silas knelt, fingers brushing the dark mark. The blood was not old enough to belong to a ghost. His gaze lifted to Anna. "This is your mother's?" She nodded, tears welling. Hope and despair mingled on her face. Valor whined softly, as if urging them to follow the scent further. Anna fumbled at her side, pulling out a scrap of paper so worn it nearly crumbled. "She dropped this when they took her," she whispered. The paper was torn from a notebook, words scrawled in a hurried hand. Medicine switched. Blackthorne. Silas's throat tightened. Proof. The piece of truth he had never possessed. His disgrace, his exile, it had been carved by this man. He closed his eyes, the fire crackling like gunfire in his ears. Grace shuddered suddenly, a sharp convulsion that sent Silas lunging forward. Her tiny chest faltered, her lips darkening again. "No!" Silas growled, clutching her, wrapping both children inside his thick army coat. He pressed them against his chest, feeling the fragile heat of their bodies. His voice dropped to a low vow. "Not here. Not like this." We're leaving. Anna looked up, confusion clouding her tears. "But the storm! The storm outside isn't half as dangerous as the one inside me if I lose her," Silas cut in. He rose, cradling Grace, his other arm steadying Anna. Valor pressed close, a silent pillar of strength. Silas pulled the door open. The gale roared in, carrying knives of snow, but he did not falter. "We go to Cedar Mercy Hospital." Tonight his words rang like orders given in a battlefield. And in a way, this was a battlefield, a war not of nations but of survival, fought in blood, snow, and breath. Together they stepped into the storm, man, children, and dog bound by fate, walking into a night that promised both danger and deliverance. The journey through the storm carved itself into Silas's memory like a scar. By the time they staggered into Cedar Mercy Medical, his arms were numb from holding Grace against his chest. Anna clung to his sleeve with what strength remained, and Valor's paws bled from cutting through the frozen crust. The hospital loomed above them like a fortress of red brick, lantern light blazing from its windows as if to defy the blizzard. Nurses rushed forward, their white coats flashing against the snow, their voices sharp and urgent. "This way, bring the baby in." Grace was lifted from Silas's arms, her small face pale against the wool of his coat. Her tiny chest rose and fell so faintly that the nurse carrying her barely dared to breathe. They pushed through swinging doors toward the neonatal unit, while Anna stumbled after, wide-eyed, her hand caught in Silas. "Don't let them take her away," she whispered, panic trembling in her voice. Silas crouched, gripping her shoulders firmly. They're saving her, Anna. We don't let go now. Valor brushed his head against Anna's hip, anchoring her to the floor to the moment. A voice called from the far corridor. Silas Carter? The tone was cautious, uncertain, yet familiar. Sheriff May Harris stood with her coat still dusted in snow, her badge gleaming in the gaslight. May was in her 40s, tall, her salt and pepper hair tied back in a practical knot, her eyes as sharp as the prairies that had raised her. Years as sheriff had given her a bearing of calm command, but beneath it lived a woman who had buried a husband, lost to a mine collapse, and had raised 2 sons on her own. She knew too well what survival demanded. May led Silas into a quieter room, where another nurse bent over a figure on a cot. The woman's arm was bandaged crudely, blood seeping through linen. Silas's breath caught. The face was worn, lips pale, but the outline was unmistakable. Sarah Miller. Anna gasped, rushing to the bedside, clutching her mother's hand. Sarah's eyelids fluttered, her chest rising shallowly. She whispered, barely audible, Silas. Her voice cracked, each word drawn through pain. You were innocent. The medicine, it was blackthorn. He switched it. I saw the words struck Silas harder than the cold ever could. Years of guilt, years of silence, all pierced by a whisper. His throat burned, his vision blurred, but his heart long frozen throbbed with new rhythm. He bent close, his scarred hand covering hers. You don't need to say more, he murmured, though his soul hung on every word. Sheriff May drew closer, her gaze hard. We'll need proof if we're to act. Sarah's trembling hand slipped toward the blanket at her side, where a bundle of cloth was hidden. May lifted it carefully, revealing a small battered notebook, its edges stiff with dried blood. Inside, words scrawled unevenly, quartermaster bribed, medicine swapped, Cole Blackthorn. Silas framed. May's face tightened, her jaw set. This changes everything, but it also paints a target on every soul in this room. She turned to Silas, her eyes like steel. Blackthorn won't stop until he erases every witness. Be ready. The storm you walked through to get here, her voice dropped low, was nothing compared to the one coming. While May spoke, Valor had planted himself outside the NICU. The German shepherd sat tall, muscles taut, amber eyes trained on the flicker of monitors behind the glass. Each time the beeping quickened, his ears twitched. A passing nurse chuckled nervously. Never seen a watchdog like this doctor's assistant with paws. Valor's tail thumped once, but his eyes never left the glass, his vigil unbroken. Anna, meanwhile, pressed her nose against a frosted window pane. With her small finger, she traced a heart into the condensation, then carefully inscribed the letter S inside. She whispered softly to herself, S for Silas, for Sarah, for shelter. The letters glowed faintly as the frost melted, like a fragile promise. Silas stood between the 2 rooms, the child fighting for breath and the woman fighting for blood. He clenched his fists, his jaw hardening. He had spent years hiding, shrinking into silence, but now the truth clawed its way to light. He no longer bore the guilt of a soldier condemned by lies. He bore a new weight, the duty to stand against Blackthorn, not for his own name, but for Anna, for Grace, for Sarah, for the family he had not asked for, yet could not abandon. The storm outside beat against the brick walls of Cedar Mercy, but the true storm gathered within. The morning after Cedar Mercy had given them a thin thread of hope. Whispering pines lay beneath a sky of gray steel. The farm looked as though it held its breath, frost clinging to the broken fences, the snow scored with deep boot marks leading nowhere good. Silas stood at the porch, one hand resting on the stock of his rifle, the other grazing Valor's head as the shepherd growled low, reading the wind before men appeared on it. Blaze, the brown stallion, stamped nervously in the yard, his nostrils flaring white. By noon, the horizon darkened with riders. Cole Blackthorn led them, silver metal glinting against his black coat. His frame was lean but taut, his face carved with sharp bones, lips always curled in a smirk that never reached his pale eyes. He carried himself like a man who thought fear was currency, and he was rich. He raised his pistol, aimed lazily toward the barn, and fired. The bullet sliced across Blaze's flank, leaving blood streaking the horse's hide. Blaze reared with a scream, hooves slamming into the snow. Anna cried out from the porch, clutching Grace tighter. Silas cursed under his breath, dragging Blaze back to safety, then turned his gaze to Blackthorn. That's the last warning shot you'll ever take here. He moved quickly, transforming the homestead into a fortress. Sandbags stacked high by the barn doors, barrels and crates rolled into barricades. And across the snowy yard, Silas strung lines of wire and tied small iron chimes, wind bells which clinked softly in the breeze. They looked innocent, almost whimsical, but to a soldier's mind they were alarms and traps waiting to spring. As dusk fell, shadows pooled at the edge of the tree line. Blackthorn's men crept closer, rifles and axes glinting in the starlight. Valor stiffened, muscles coiled, his ears twitching. Silas knelt, murmuring, "Now, boy." We hold the first torch swung forward. Silas raised his rifle and shot not at a man, but at the torch itself. Flames sputtered, plunged them into sudden dark. Chaos erupted. Valor leapt, a black streak against the snow, tearing into the line of men, forcing them toward the boggy patch Silas had marked, where thawing ice turned ground into mire. Boots sank. Men cursed. Chimes rang out, sharp and metallic, betraying every step. Inside the farmhouse, Sarah crouched against the kitchen table, her wounded arm bound tighter, a bottle of antiseptic clutched like a weapon. The door banged open, a thug lunged in, knife flashing. Sarah hurled the bottle. Glass shattered across his face, liquid burning into his eyes. He screamed and stumbled back into the snow. Anna, hiding behind the cradle, pressed Grace close and whispered fiercely, "Valor only barks when something's truly scary. If he's quiet, we're safe outside." Valor let out a thunderous bark that shook the rafters. Anna's eyes widened. "Oh, then it's scary for real." Her nervous giggle slipped out even as her heart pounded. Through the din came the pounding of hooves. An old voice bellowed, "Hold fast, Carter!" Gus Whitaker rode in, his white beard blowing wild, his back bent but his arms steady as he swung a rifle across his saddle. Gus was past 60, a farmer Silas had once dragged from beneath a collapsing barn during the war years. Tonight he came with 3 neighbors, men hardened by land and loss, their eyes aflame with loyalty long owed. They charged the flank, scattering Blackthorn's men with a roar of hooves and fire. Yet Cole himself strode forward through the chaos, holding papers high, his voice carrying, "Sheriff! This man hides illegal weapons here. Signed documents prove it." He threw the forged pages at May Harris, who had just ridden in with a small detachment. May's weathered face remained unreadable as she collected the papers, her men uneasy, unsure. "I'll check the records myself," she said, pulling back. For a breath, doubt hung in the night like smoke. Blackthorn snarled, waving his hand. "Finish it! Burn the farm down." His men surged again. Blades raised. The chimes clattered like alarm bells, and Silas's traps answered, ropes yanked taut, tripping legs, sending bodies sprawling into snow. Valor darted among them, his teeth flashing, tearing rifles free from hands, scattering them into the drifts. Silas's rifle cracked twice more, extinguishing torches, drowning the siege in darkness. May returned at last, her voice clear as iron. "These papers are forgeries." She raised Sarah's blood-stained notebook, high for all to see. And here is testimony signed in her hand, evidence enough to hang Blackthorn twice over. Men wavered, the tide shifting. Silas leveled his rifle, his voice steady but heavy with years of buried fury. "It ends here, Cole." Valor stood at his side, growling deep, eyes glowing in the firelight. Sheriff May strode forward, cuffs in her hand, as Blackthorn froze for the first time, his smirk faltering. "Cole Blackthorn," she declared, "you're under arrest for fraud, assault, and abduction." The click of iron around his wrists echoed louder than the storm. In the stillness that followed, the only sound was Valor's bark, sharp, proud, victorious. The snow had finally ceased its assault, leaving the land softened beneath a blanket of white. As the sun rose, it cast an amber glow across the fields. and the light seemed to settle like a promise upon whispering pines. Smoke curled from the farmhouse chimney, not the desperate smoke of survival, but the steady thin line of a hearth that belonged to a home. For the first time in years, Silas Carter felt that the world was not only filled with loss, but also with fragile beginnings. Cole Blackthorne had been hauled away under Sheriff May Harris's stern watch the night before, iron clinking at his wrists. Yet even in chains, his pale eyes had glinted with something unspoken, as if he were merely a piece in a larger shadow. May, standing beside Silas on the porch as the morning broke, leaned closer. Her voice was low but edged with steel. Don't let relief blind you. Blackthorne had allies, men with money, reach, and no conscience. This battle isn't finished. Silas kept his gaze on the horizon, arms folded across his broad chest, the scar on his cheek catching the sunlight. Then let them come. We'll meet them with truth. And with family, May studied him for a moment, nodded once, then mounted her horse. She was not a woman who wasted words, and Silas respected her for it. Inside, Grace stirred in her cradle. Her tiny breaths came evenly now, chest rising and falling, with a rhythm that no longer terrified Anna. The girl had spent nights flinching at every knock of the wind against the shutters. But this morning, when the draft rattled the old glass, she simply tightened the blanket around Grace and whispered, "It's only the breeze." The haunted look in her eyes had lessened, replaced by the cautious steadiness of a child learning that safety was no longer an illusion. Later, as the sun climbed higher, Silas stood on the porch with Sarah beside him. Her arm remained bound, though the bandages were clean and the color had returned to her face. Gus Whitaker was there too, stooping a little, his beard tangled but his grin boyish despite the years. "I reckon this old place needs more laughter than gunfire," he muttered, patting his horse. On that porch, with only Valor sitting proud at Silas's feet, they held a ceremony so simple it could almost have been overlooked. No gown, no flowers, no gathered crowd, only two silver bands, plain and unpolished, passed from Gus's calloused hands. Sarah slid one onto Silas's finger, her touch trembling but certain. Silas returned the gesture, his deep voice rumbling like a vow carved into stone. "This house is a place to come home to. No more wandering, no more graves without light." Anna peeked from the doorway. Grace nestled in her arms, her face bright with curiosity. Sheriff May cleared her throat, pulling a paper from her coat. "And there's one more matter." She read formally, "From this day forward, Anna Miller shall be known as Anna Carter." Anna's eyes widened. She rushed forward, clutching Silas's sleeve. "I'll always be Mama's girl, but now I have a papa too." And Valor answered with a crisp bark, perfectly timed, his tail thudding the porch floor like a signature. The adults laughed, the sound ringing freer than gunfire ever could. As the day eased into afternoon, Sarah led Anna to a small corner of the yard, where roses bloomed crimson despite the frost. It was Silas's rose of Emma, his memorial garden for the daughter he had lost. Sarah bent, plucked one bloom, and tucked it gently behind Anna's ear. "Flowers bloom even in the cold," she said softly, "just like you." Anna smiled shyly, lifting Grace higher in her arms as though to share the gift with her sister. On the porch, Silas began teaching Anna small hand signals, for Valor fingers raised for stay, palm forward for guard, a gentle sweep for gentle. Anna tried clumsily, her small fingers awkward, but Valor followed each command with soldierly precision. When Anna waved wrong and stumbled, Valor tilted his head, then performed the trick anyway, earning a squeal of laughter. Even Sarah laughed, the sound like a bell after years of silence. Silas found himself smiling, a deep warmth spreading in his chest that had nothing to do with firelight. As dusk painted the snow gold, Silas stood at the edge of the porch. He gazed across the vast field, their white expanse glowing beneath the last rays of the sun. His hand rested lightly on Valor's head, his eyes distant but no longer hollow. "We did not win with bullets," he said quietly, his words carried by the wind. "We won with light, something they will never understand." Behind him, Anna's laughter mingled with Grace's steady breathing and Valor's quiet, steadfast presence. The home he thought forever broken had awakened, not just to another dawn, but to a new life beginning. When the snow finally melts in Whispering Pines, it's not just a new dawn for Silas, Sarah, Anna, Grace, and faithful Valor. It's proof that even in life's coldest winters, love can take root again, and truth can weather the storm. This story reminds us that home isn't just where we're born, it's where we choose to protect with all our might. Have you ever had a moment when hope seemed lost, only for a small act of love or courage to bring light back into your world? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear. And if this story touches your heart, like the video, follow and subscribe so you don't miss the next story about faith, family, and second chances.